The crystal glass didn't just fall, it exploded against the marble, sending a spray of crimson wine across the Duke's gold-embroidered boots like a fresh wound. Adrian Blackwood didn't flinch, didn't swear, and didn't move. He stood paralyzed, his lungs suddenly refusing to pull air, because the woman he had treated as a voiceless possession for 3 years had finally leaned in and whispered the only sentence he would ever hear her say. In that single breath, she hadn't just broken her silence, she had stripped him of his title, his fortune, and his very soul. As the masquerade dancers whirled around them in a blur of silk and laughter, Adrian stared into Evangeline's cold, beautiful eyes and realized that while he was busy playing the master, she had been playing the executioner. He had spent 1,000 days praying to hear her voice, but as the echoes of her betrayal took root in his mind, he realized he would spend the rest of his life wishing she had stayed silent. You think you know the cost of a secret, but Adrian Blackwood was about to learn that some silences are kept not out of submission, but out of a hunger for total, calculated ruin. The vibration of the shattering glass seemed to hum through the floorboards long after the sound died away. To the earls and countesses sipping champagne just a few feet away, it was merely a clumsy accident by a man who had perhaps indulged in too much brandy. But to Adrian, the world had gone violently silent. The orchestra was still playing a lively waltz. The candles were still casting a warm, deceptive glow over the ballroom, but all he could hear was the ghost of her voice, low, steady, and sharp as a razor, cutting through the 3-year illusion of his marriage. He looked down at the red stains spreading across the white marble, then slowly up at Evangeline. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She didn't even look like the living mannequin he had spent years mocking in the dark corners of their estate. Behind the heavy black lace of her veil, her eyes were bright with a terrifying, lucid intelligence. She stood perfectly still, her hand still resting lightly on his decorated shoulder, a gesture that he had once mistaken for a sign of her dependence. Now he felt the weight of it like a predator's claw. "Adrian," a voice called out from the crowd. It was the Marquis of Somerset, approaching with a jovial, drunken grin. "A bit heavy-handed with the vintage tonight, aren't we? Or has the Duchess finally stunned you with her beauty?" Adrian tried to speak, but his throat felt as though it were filled with the very shards of glass lying at his feet. He wanted to scream, to grab her, to demand she take it back, but he was a duke of the realm, and his pride, the very thing she had just dismantled, held him in a vice grip of public decorum. He could only stare at her, his face a mask of hollow, haunted shock. Evangeline didn't look at the Marquis. She didn't look at the crowd. She kept her gaze fixed on her husband, her blood-red lips curling into the faintest, most devastating shadow of a smile. She had waited 3 years for this exact moment of collapse. She had watched him sign every document, heard him boast of every bribe, and recorded every sin he thought was safe in the presence of a woman who couldn't speak. The Duke's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He realized then that the silence hadn't been his victory, it had been his prison. And as she slowly pulled her hand away from his sash, leaving him standing alone amidst the wreckage of the glass and his life, he understood the true nature of his apocalypse. He had finally gotten exactly what he asked for, and it was going to kill him. The memory of their wedding day did not come to Adrian with the warmth of a celebration. It arrived like the cold, clinical recollection of a business transaction. 3 years ago, the air in the Montrose study had been thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the desperate, cloying scent of a man who knew he was drowning. Lord Montrose had sat across from Adrian, his hands trembling so violently that the amber liquid in his glass danced against the crystal. The ledger between them was a map of ruin, thousands of pounds lost to the green baize tables of London's most predatory gambling dens. To any other man, it was a tragedy. To Adrian Blackwood, it was an opportunity. He didn't need the money. He had more gold than the crown had common sense. What he needed was the one thing his money couldn't buy, the prestige of the Montrose bloodline and a wife who would serve as the ultimate testament to his absolute control. "I can make these debts vanish with a single stroke of my pen, Arthur," Adrian had said, his voice as smooth and lethal as polished marble. "But I do not buy paper, I buy legacies." The price had been Evangeline. When she was called into the room, she hadn't come in weeping or pleading. She had walked in with a grace that felt like a localized winter, her spine a column of steel that refused to bend, even as her father explained that he had traded her life for his ledger. Adrian remembered the way he had looked at her then, not as a woman, but as a masterpiece he was finally adding to his collection. He had expected an outburst, a feminine display of hysterics that he could then soothe with a display of his overwhelming wealth. Instead, Evangeline had looked him directly in the eye, her expression unreadable, and said absolutely nothing. The wedding at St. George's had been a grim, opulent affair. Adrian had spared no expense, draping the church in white lilies that smelled of a funeral. He wanted the world to see his triumph. He wanted every man in the ton to know that the untouchable Lady Evangeline Montrose was now Blackwood property. During the vows, when the priest prompted her to speak, the silence began, a long, agonizing stretch of time where the only sound was the flickering of candles. Adrian had tightened his grip on her hand, his thumb pressing into her skin as a silent command to obey. He thought it was nerves. He thought she was merely playing the part of the modest, overwhelmed bride. Eventually, the priest had taken her slight, almost imperceptible nod as consent. But as they drove away in the carriage, leaving the cheering crowds behind, the silence didn't break. "You may speak now, Evangeline," Adrian had said, leaning back against the velvet cushions, a glass of port already in his hand. "There is no audience here. You can thank me for saving your father from the gallows." She had simply looked out the window, the passing street lamps casting rhythmic bars of light across her face. She looked like a ghost trapped in silk. "I am speaking to you," he'd snapped, his ego pricked by her lack of gratitude. "I have given you my name. I have given you a life of luxury that most women would kill for. The least you can do is acknowledge your master." Evangeline had turned her head then. She didn't look angry. She looked at him with a profound, terrifying pity that made his blood boil. She didn't open her lips. She didn't sigh. She simply watched him, her silence acting as a mirror that reflected his own ugliness back at him. Adrian had laughed it off that night, telling himself it was a game of wills he was guaranteed to win. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He broke horses, he broke men, and he would certainly break a girl who thought silence was a shield. He didn't realize that by purchasing her father's debt, he had invited a silent witness into the darkest corners of his life. He had bought a duchess, yes, but he had also bought the one person who would never be bought, never be charmed, and never be fooled by the medals on his chest. He had walked into that marriage thinking he was the creditor. He had no idea that for every day she remained silent, the interest on his own sins was compounding, waiting for the moment he was most bankrupt to finally be collected. The first year of their marriage was an exercise in gilded cruelty. Adrian Blackwood quickly learned that while he owned Evangeline's body and her title, her presence was nothing more than a haunting, beautiful void. To the outside world, she was the enigma of Mayfair, a woman so refined and so elevated that she didn't deign to speak to the common aristocracy. But behind the closed doors of Blackwood Manor, Adrian viewed her silence as a personal insult, a fortress he was determined to lay siege to until it crumbled. He began to treat her like a doll, a living mannequin designed to showcase his wealth and his supposed patience. He would summon the finest dressmakers from Paris to their drawing room, forcing Evangeline to stand for hours as they pinned heavy brocades and suffocating silks to her frame. He would circle her like a shark, touching the fabric, adjusting the jewelry at her throat with fingers that lingered a second too long, not in affection, but in a display of ownership. "Tell the seamstress if the corset is too tight, Evangeline," he would drawl, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of discomfort. "Unless, of course, you prefer to suffocate in silence." She never gave him the satisfaction of a grimace. She remained a statue of marble and lace, her breathing so shallow it barely stirred the air. The social season became his theater of war. He paraded her through every ballroom, every opera box, and every garden party in the kingdom. He enjoyed the way the room fell silent when they entered, the Duke of Blackwood and his mute masterpiece. He would engage in loud, boisterous conversations with his peers, often speaking for her in a tone that was dripping with condescension. "The Duchess finds the concerto a bit Derivative, don't you, darling? He would say to a crowded table, patting her hand as if she were a prize hound. She's so very particular. Her standards are quite impossible to meet. He waited for her to snap. He waited for the moment her pride would force a correction, a protest, or even a plea for him to stop. Instead, she became a master of the subtle art of observation. While Adrian preened and boasted, soaking in the admiration of the ton, Evangeline's eyes remained active. She watched the way he exchanged coded glances with shady financiers. She noted which ministers he cornered for private whispers about land enclosures and grain taxes. She saw the sweat on his brow when a certain courier arrived with a letter bearing a government seal. Adrian's cruelty escalated as his frustration grew. One evening, after a particularly grueling night at the theater where she had refused to acknowledge his jokes, he cleared the servants from the dining hall. The room was vast, the shadows stretching long under the flickering candlelight. He walked to the head of the table where she sat, untouched by the feast before her. "Is it a vow?" he hissed, leaning down until his breath stirred the loose tendrils of hair at her temple. "Is it some pathetic religious penance, or do you simply think yourself too good for the language of your husband?" He picked up a heavy gold candelabra and held it close to her face, the heat of the flames dancing in her pupils. "I could burn this house down around you, and I truly believe you'd let the smoke take you before you'd scream my name. What will it take, Evangeline? Gold, pain, fear." She didn't flinch. She didn't move away from the heat. She simply looked through him as if he were made of glass. It was during that first year that Adrian's obsession took a dark, psychological turn. He began to talk to her more than he talked to anyone else, spilling his secrets into her silence like water into a well. He told her of his maneuvers to ruin his rivals, his contempt for the Prince Regent, and the offshore accounts he used to hide the family's dwindling liquid assets from the tax collectors. He convinced himself that because she didn't speak, she was a safe repository for his darkness, a beautiful, locked box where he could store his sins. He didn't realize that a locked box works both ways. While he thought he was filling her with his power, he was actually providing her with the very stones she would eventually use to build his gallows. He saw a mannequin. She saw a man so blinded by his own voice that he had forgotten how to listen to the shadows. By the end of that first year, Adrian was no longer just her husband, he was her unwitting informant. To the world, and especially to the man who claimed to own her, Evangeline was a void. Adrian looked at her and saw a mirror of his own magnificence, a vessel of quietude that he filled with his own booming voice. He was so convinced of her emptiness that he treated her like a piece of furniture, something that occupied a space but possessed no agency. He was wrong. Silence was not her cage, it was her vantage point. Inside the quiet sanctuary of her mind, Evangeline was more alive than she had ever been when she was free. Every moment Adrian spent trying to provoke her, she spent cataloguing his rot. While he paced the study, complaining about the insolence of the working class or the meddling of the treasury, Evangeline sat by the window with her embroidery, her needle moving in a rhythmic, deceptive dance. She wasn't stitching flowers, she was counting his lies. She had become a ghost in her own home, drifting through the corridors of Blackwood Manor with a soft, velvet tread that no one ever noticed. Because everyone believed she had no voice, they assumed she had no presence. Servants whispered of the Duke's mounting debts as they polished the silver. Clerks left sensitive ledgers open on the desk while they went to fetch the Duke's brandy, assuming the silent doll in the corner couldn't read the columns of red ink. She learned to read the Duke's moods by the scent of his skin. Bitter tobacco meant he had lost at the clubs. The sharp tang of ozone and expensive gin meant he had just successfully bribed a magistrate. But more importantly, she learned to read his desk. In the dead of night, when Adrian was snoring in a drunken stupor, Evangeline would rise. She moved like a shadow through the cold, moonlit hallways, her bare feet silent on the Persian rugs. In his study, she became a master of the unseen. She didn't need to break locks. She had watched him hide the key behind the portrait of his grandfather enough times to know its weight by heart. She found the second ledger, the one bound in dark, bruised leather that never saw the light of a legitimate audit. In those pages, she found the truth of the Blackwood legacy. It was built on the bones of the vulnerable. There were names of widows whose lands had been seized through forged signatures, records of shipments that bypassed the customs house under the cover of the Duke's military medals, and the most damning of all, the systematic siphoning of the Montrose estate's remaining trust into Adrian's private accounts. He hadn't just married her to settle her father's debt. He had married her to cannibalize what was left of her family's history. As she stood in the silver light of the moon, memorizing the dates, the amounts, and the names of the co-conspirators, a cold, sharp fire burned in her chest. Adrian thought he was the hunter, but he was merely a loud, clumsy beast making a trail of blood through the woods. She didn't need to scream to stop him. She only needed to wait. She began to correspond with the shadows. Using the Duke's own stationery and a hand that perfectly mimicked the frantic, jagged script of an anonymous whistleblower, she sent fragments of information to the right people, a disgruntled creditor here, a rival Duke there, and a very specific inspector at the Royal Exchange. She never wrote from herself. She was the ghost, the whisper in the wind, the ink that appeared on a desk when no one was looking. Adrian would come to her during the day, his face flushed with the first signs of a brewing scandal he couldn't quite pin down. He would grab her by the chin, forcing her to look into his bloodshot eyes. "The world is turning against me, Evangeline," he would growl, his grip bruising. "Traitors are everywhere. At least I have you, you who are too simple, too quiet to ever betray a man like me." She would look back at him, her expression a perfect mask of vacant submission, while internally she hummed a melody of ruin. She wasn't broken. She was a vault, and she was slowly, methodically, emptying him out from the inside. He wanted a silent wife, and she gave him exactly that, a silence so absolute it allowed him to hang himself with his own words. By the third year, the cracks in the Duke's gilded exterior were no longer invisible. The rumors of his instability had begun to circulate through the coffee houses and clubs like a slow-acting poison. Creditors who had once bowed at his carriage wheels were now standing at the gates of Blackwood Manor with cold eyes and long memories. Adrian was a man accustomed to the world bending to his will, but for the first time in his life, the world was pushing back. The second ledger that Evangeline had so meticulously memorized was bleeding. The offshore accounts were being frozen by unseen hands, and the bribes that once smoothed his path were being returned by officials who suddenly feared for their own necks. Adrian spent his nights packing the library, his shadows dancing wildly against the mahogany shelves. He looked like a man haunted, his hair disheveled, his cravat perpetually loosened. "They are coming for me, Evangeline," he whispered one night, packing before her as she sat by the fire. He didn't look at her, he looked through her, using her silence as a sounding board for his madness. "The hyenas are at the door. They think they can strip a Blackwood of his pride. They think I am weak because the gold has thinned." He stopped suddenly, his eyes landing on her with a predatory glint that made the air in the room turn brittle. He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy and uneven. He reached out, running a trembling hand over the pearls at her neck, pearls that were, in truth, one of the last liquid assets he had left. "But I still have you," he murmured, his voice dropping into a dark, conspiratorial register. "The silent Duchess, the woman of pure, untouchable mystery. There are men, Evangeline, vile, powerful men, who find your silence intoxicating. They see you as the ultimate prize, a woman who knows how to keep a secret because she has no voice to tell one." The gamble he proposed was the darkest transgression of their marriage. Adrian had been approached by Baron Vane, a man whose wealth was matched only by his depravity. Vane didn't want land, and he didn't want the Duke's empty promises. He wanted a trophy to grace his private estate for a month, a silent companion to sit at his table and endure his whims. In exchange, the Baron would provide the massive infusion of capital needed to pay off the Duke's most aggressive lenders. Adrian was prepared to sell his wife's dignity to save his own skin. "It is a small price to pay for our future," Adrian said, his voice rising with a desperate, frantic justification. He knelt before her, clutching her hands in his. For a moment he looked almost pathetic. "You won't have to say a word. You never do. You will just be there, a beautiful ghost in his halls until the debt is cleared. You owe me this, Evangeline. I saved your father. I gave you this house. Now you must save me." He looked into her eyes, searching for a sign of the woman he had bought, expecting the same vacant submission he had cultivated for 3 years. But for a fleeting second, the mask slipped. Behind the stillness of her face, A cold, sharp blade of contempt flickered. She didn't pull away. She didn't scream. She simply allowed her hands to go limp in his, as if she were already a corpse. Silence, Adrian laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound that echoed in the empty house. It is your greatest virtue, isn't it? You can't even say no. You can't tell the world what I've done. You are the perfect collateral. He spent the next week preparing for the deal, unaware that his perfect collateral had already moved the final piece into place. While Adrian met with Vane's lawyers in the study, Evangeline was in the music room, her fingers ghosting over the piano keys without making a sound. She was thinking of the midwinter masquerade, only a fortnight away. She knew that Adrian intended to finalize the transaction under the cover of the ball, handing her over like a thoroughbred traded between stables. He believed his ruin was behind him, that this one final act of cruelty would restore his empire. He didn't realize that by putting a price on her silence, he had finally given her the reason to break it. The Duke was betting his life on her being a statue. He had no idea she was a landslide, waiting for the first crack to bring the whole mountain down. The air inside Blackwood Manor on the night of the midwinter masquerade was thick with the scent of hothouse lilies and the metallic tang of impending rain. Thousands of beeswax candles dripped gold onto silver sconces, casting a flickering, restless light over the assembly of London's elite. To anyone else, it was the pinnacle of the social season. To Adrian Blackwood, it was a coronation. He moved through the ballroom like a king restored, his navy frock coat stiff with gold embroidery and his chest heavy with medals that caught the light with every arrogant stride. The secret deal with Baron Vane had filled his pockets with enough borrowed confidence to mask the rot beneath. He clutched a crystal glass of brandy as if it were a scepter, his laughter booming over the delicate strains of the orchestra. He felt invincible. He had sold a soul that wasn't his to lose, and in his mind, the accounts were finally settled. "Look at them, Evangeline," he leaned in to whisper, his breath smelling of expensive spirits and victory. He didn't look at her, he looked at the crowd, savoring the way they parted for him. "They thought I was finished. They whispered in the clubs like rats in the walls, but tonight they see I am Blackwood, I am the sun they orbit." Evangeline walked a half-step behind him, a shadow draped in mystery. She was a vision of morning masquerading as high fashion, her face obscured by a heavy veil of black chantilly lace that clung to her like a spider's web. She wore a dark cloak over a gown the color of a bruised plum, looking less like a duchess and more like a silent judge. Every time a guest approached to offer a compliment, Adrian would cut them off with a sharp, boastful anecdote, parading her silence as a mark of her exquisite, untouchable breeding. He was at his most loquacious, his words spilling out in a frantic, desperate stream. He felt the need to fill every silence, to drown out the growing unease that had been gnawing at his gut for weeks. He led her toward the far end of the ballroom, where Baron Vane stood waiting near the velvet-curtained alcoves. The Baron was a man with eyes like flat stones, his gaze fixed on Evangeline with a hunger that was purely transactional. "A magnificent evening, Duke," Vane said, his voice a low rattle. He tapped a heavy signet ring against his thumb. "The atmosphere is quite intoxicating. I trust our arrangements are finalized for the morning departure." Adrian's hand tightened on the stem of his glass, but his smile didn't waver. "Of course, Baron, the Duchess is prepared. She has always been a woman who understands the value of a quiet life." He let out a sharp, jagged laugh and turned back to the room, raising his glass in a mock toast to the very people he had spent the year defrauding. He felt a surge of intoxicating power. He was walking on the edge of a precipice, but he was convinced he could fly. He began to mock the guests under his breath, pointing out their debts and their scandals, unaware that the very men he ridiculed were exchanging looks of grim anticipation. He didn't notice the way the Royal Exchange inspector he had once bribed was now standing by the door, flanked by two men in sober, official dress. He didn't see the way the servants, the invisible ghosts of his household, were moving with a quiet, purposeful urgency, clearing the way for a finale he hadn't written. Adrian turned to Evangeline, his face flushed with a dark, manic heat. He felt the urge to humiliate her one last time before she was gone, to prove to himself that he was the master of the silence he had grown to hate. "Speak to them, darling," he urged, his voice loud enough to draw a circle of curious onlookers. "Just one word to say goodbye to our guests. Tell them how much you've enjoyed being my silent, perfect bride." He laughed, expecting the usual hollow stillness. He didn't see the way her hand moved toward his shoulder, not in submission, but with the steady, possessive grip of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. The clock in the hallway began its slow, heavy toll toward midnight. Adrian stood at the center of his world, bloated with pride and stolen gold, completely unaware that he had just walked into the center of the web she had been weaving for 1,000 days. The trap was sprung, the guests were gathered, and the Duke was the only one who didn't know the party was over. As the clock ticked toward the final hour of the masquerade, a strange, chilling shift swept through the ballroom. Adrian had been holding court near the punch bowl, his voice a raucous bark of triumph, when he realized the music had stumbled. The lively waltz faltered into a discordant murmur as the guests turned their heads toward the grand staircase. Adrian followed their gaze, his irritation at the interruption already rising to his throat. Then he saw her. Evangeline had slipped away minutes before, but the woman who returned was not the obedient, plum-clad doll he had been parading all evening. She stood at the top of the stairs, a silhouette of absolute darkness against the gold-leafed rot of the manor. She was draped in heavy, funereal black, a gown of midnight silk paired with a mourning veil so thick it seemed to swallow the candlelight. She looked like a widow who had arrived to claim a body, despite the fact that her husband stood healthy and vibrant in the center of the room. A hush fell over the ton, a silence far more profound than any Evangeline had ever maintained. It was the sound of a scandal breaking in real time. The symbolism was as sharp as a slap. In the height of a celebration meant to signal the Duke's resurgence, his wife had appeared dressed for his death. Adrian felt a cold prickle of sweat break across his brow. He tried to summon his usual bravado, forcing a smile that felt brittle on his face. "Evangeline, my dear," he called out, his voice cracking slightly in the hollow room. "A bit theatrical, don't you think? The theme was midwinter, not the graveyard." She didn't answer. She began her descent, the black silk whispering against the marble like the scales of a serpent. Every step was measured, intentional, and terrifyingly calm. The crowd parted before her as if she carried a contagion. Adrian watched her, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The medals on his chest, which had felt like armor only moments ago, now felt like heavy, useless lead. He looked around for support, seeking the stony gaze of Baron Vane, but the Baron was no longer looking at Evangeline with lust. He was looking at her with a dawning, pale-faced realization. Vane had seen that specific shade of mourning before. It was the color of a woman who had already won. As she reached the ballroom floor, Evangeline didn't head for the refreshments or the dancers. She walked straight toward the Duke. The light from the chandeliers caught the blood-red lipstick she wore, the only splash of color in her entire ensemble. It looked like a fresh stain on a shroud. "What is this?" Adrian hissed as she reached him, his hand reaching out to grab her arm, to pull her into the shadows and demand an explanation. But his hand stopped midair. There was an aura around her now, a cold, sovereign power that he had never encountered. He realized, with a jolt of pure terror, that he was no longer the most important person in the room. He was merely the centerpiece of her performance. The guests began to whisper, the sound rising like the hum of a disturbed hive. They weren't looking at his medals or his gold. They were looking at the widow and the man she was clearly mourning. The visual narrative was undeniable. Adrian Blackwood was a ghost, a man whose empire had already fallen, standing in a house that was no longer his. Evangeline stopped just inches from him, the scent of her, not the lilies of the house, but the sharp, clean scent of winter air and old paper, filled his lungs. Through the black lace of her veil, he could see her eyes. They weren't vacant. They were burning with a terrifying, triumphant light. Adrian's grip on his wine glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. He felt small. He felt exposed. He realized that the veil wasn't meant to hide her face from the world. It was meant to hide the world from the satisfaction she felt as she watched him drown in the silence she had finally perfected. She had arrived as a widow because she had already buried him in the ledgers, the secrets, and the sins he had thought were safe in her keeping. The marriage was over, and as she stood before him in the center of his own ballroom, Adrian realized he was the only one left to attend the funeral. The first chime of the grandfather clock in the hall struck like a hammer against an anvil, vibrating through the floorboards and chilling the very air of the ballroom. Adrian felt the sound in his teeth. He looked at the circle of expectant, masked faces surrounding them, then back at the black-veiled specter of his wife. The arrogance that had sustained him for 3 years was leaking out of him, leaving a hollow, trembling cold in its wake. "Evangeline," he stammered, his voice a pathetic ghost of its former boom. "Enough of this. The Baron is waiting. The carriage is readied. You will come with me now, or I swear." The second chime drowned out his threat. Evangeline didn't flinch. Instead, she moved. She took a single step closer, closing the distance until the heat of her body met the cold sweat of his. Her hand rose, not in the limp submission he was used to, but with a deliberate, possessive strength as she gripped his shoulder. Her fingers dug into the navy wool of his frock coat, pinning him to the spot. By the sixth chime, the room had fallen into a deathly, unnatural silence. Even the breathing of the guests seemed to have suspended. Adrian's hand, slick with perspiration, began to lose its purchase on the crystal glass he held. He stared at her red lips through the lace, his mind screaming for her to stay quiet, for the silence to return to the way it was, safe, empty, and powerless. But the clock struck the 12th tone, and the living mannequin finally leaned into his ear. Her voice was not the frail, hesitant thing he had imagined. It was a low, melodic thrum, steady and lethal. She spoke only 7 words, her breath warm against his skin as she dismantled his world. "The crown has the ledger. Run, Adrian." The glass shattered against the marble floor at the exact moment his heart did. The sound was an explosion in the quiet, a spray of crimson wine that soaked into his gold embroidery like a shameful brand. Adrian's knees buckled. He didn't hear the gasps of the crowd or the sudden, heavy boots of the Royal Exchange inspectors moving toward the center of the room. He could only hear those 7 words looping in his mind, a rhythmic death knell. "The crown has the ledger." The second ledger, the dark, bruised leather book where he had recorded his forgeries, his bribes, and the systematic theft of her inheritance. He had whispered those secrets to her as if she were a stone wall, confident that she could never repeat them. He realized then, with a soul-crushing clarity, that she hadn't just been listening, she had been transcribing. She hadn't been a victim of his power, she had been the archivist of his crimes. He looked up at her, his face a mask of shattered composure, his eyes hollow and haunted. The woman in the black veil didn't look down at him with anger. She looked at him with the cold, detached satisfaction of a mathematician who had finally solved a long, tedious equation. She had been the one in control from the moment they said their vows. Her silence wasn't a cage, it was the cloak under which she had sharpened her blade. "You," he gasped, the word catching in a throat constricted by terror. Evangeline slowly reached up and pulled back the black lace of her veil. For the first time in 3 years, she looked at him without the mask of vacancy. Her eyes were sharp, bright, and terrifyingly free. She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. The inspectors were already flanking him, their faces grim, their authority absolute. As they took him by the arms, Adrian realized the ultimate irony of his vanity. He had spent 1,000 days praying to hear her voice, and now that he had heard it, he would spend the rest of his life in a cold, stone cell, wishing he had stayed deaf forever. He was no longer the Duke of Blackwood. He was merely a man caught in the echoes of a silence he was never smart enough to fear. The chaos that followed the shattering of the glass was not a scream, but a frantic, desperate scrambling. Adrian lunged forward, his fingers clawing at the air as if he could snatch the words back out of the silence and shove them down her throat. His face was a contorted mask of purple rage and white-hot terror. He looked at the inspectors closing in, then at the woman who had just signed his death warrant with a whisper. "Guards," Adrian bellowed, his voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Seize her. This woman is a lunatic, a thief. She has stolen state documents. Arrest her at once." He turned to the men stationed at the great oak doors, men he had handpicked, men whose loyalty he had bought with gold and the promise of his protection. They were his personal pack of wolves. The muscle that ensured his word was law within the walls of Blackwood Manor. 2 of them stepped forward, their heavy boots thumping against the marble, their hands resting on the hilts of their sabers. Adrian pointed a trembling finger at Evangeline. "I said seize her. Why do you hesitate? Throw her into the cellar, now." The guards stopped. They didn't look at the Duke. Instead, they looked at Evangeline. And then, in a gesture that felt like the earth itself shifting on its axis, they lowered their heads in a sharp, synchronized bow. They didn't move toward her to arrest her. They moved to stand behind her, forming a wall of iron and wool that shielded her from her husband. Adrian's arm dropped to his side. His mouth hung open, a silent O of disbelief. "What is this? I pay your wages. I am the Duke of Blackwood." "No, your grace," the captain of the guard said, his voice devoid of its usual subservience. He didn't even look at the man he had served for a decade. "The wages for the last 6 months have come from the Duchess's private accounts, the ones you thought were empty, and the orders we received this morning didn't come from the War Office. They came from the magistrate." Evangeline stood perfectly still, the center of the storm. She didn't have to raise her hand or raise her voice. The power had not just shifted, it had vanished from Adrian's grasp like smoke in a gale. He looked around the ballroom and realized the truth. The servants who had stood so invisibly in the corners were now blocking the exits. The guests he had mocked were now looking at him with the cold, detached interest of people watching a wounded animal finally succumb to the hunt. Even Baron Vane had retreated into the shadows, his face pale, realizing the collateral he had tried to purchase was now the owner of the bank. "You've been paying them," Adrian whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "With what? You had nothing. I took everything from your father." For the second time that night, Evangeline broke her silence, but she didn't speak to him. She looked at the chief inspector, her voice clear and resonant, carrying to every corner of the room. "The documents are in the carriage, Inspector. Every forged signature, every siphoned pound from the Montrose Trust, and the correspondence with the French blockade runners. You will find that the Duke's signatures are quite authentic." Adrian tried to rush her then, a final, pathetic burst of violence fueled by the knowledge that he was truly, utterly lost. He wanted to wrap his hands around her throat and feel the life leave the woman who had tricked him so thoroughly. But the guards he had once commanded stepped forward, crossing their pikes with a metallic clack that stopped him cold. He was a prisoner in his own home. He looked at the walls, the portraits of his ancestors, the gold leaf and the crystal, and saw only a tomb. Evangeline stepped past him, her black morning silk brushing against his boots. She didn't look back. She didn't need to see the look on his face as the shackles were brought forth. She had spent 3 years watching him. Now she was finished with the sight of him forever. The House of Blackwood wasn't just falling, it had already collapsed. Adrian was merely the last person to feel the weight of the rubble. The morning sun that rose over Blackwood Manor did not bring the warmth of a new beginning. It cast a cold, clinical light on a corpse of an empire. The great house, once a fortress of arrogance, was now eerily quiet. The guests had long since fled. The inspectors had concluded their grim harvest of the Duke's ledgers, and the servants had vanished into the mist, taking with them the last vestiges of a household built on fear. Adrian sat alone in the center of the ballroom. He was still wearing his navy frock coat, but the crimson sash was torn, and the gold medals felt like lead weights pulling him toward the floor. His hands, stained with the dried red wine from the night before, rested limply on his knees. He looked less like a duke and more like a hollowed-out tree, struck by lightning and left to rot in an open field. He listened to the silence, but it was no longer the obedient, empty thing he had commanded for 3 years. It was a loud, mocking presence that echoed with the memory of 7 words. Outside, the heavy iron gates of the estate groaned open. Evangeline stood at the threshold of the manor, framed by the grey London dawn. She had shed the heavy mourning veil. For the first time, the cool morning air touched her face, and she breathed it in with a hunger that was almost painful. She held a small, leather travel bag, the only thing she chose to take from the ruins of her marriage. She turned for one final look at the house. Through the towering windows of the ballroom, she could see the silhouette of the man she had dismantled. He looked small. He looked insignificant. For 1,000 days, he had tried to fill her silence with his own noise, never realizing that her quiet was a reservoir of strength, while his voice was merely a mask for his vacancy. He had mistaken her lack of speech for a lack of soul, and in that delusion, he had handed her the keys to his kingdom. My lady, the carriage driver whispered, bowing low. He was a man who had seen the Duke's cruelty firsthand, and he looked at Evangeline now with a reverence that was earned, not bought. Where to? Evangeline looked past the gates, toward the horizon where the city was just beginning to wake. Away, she said. Her voice was steady, light, and filled with the terrifying beauty of a woman who finally owned herself. It was a voice that would never again be used to settle a debt or satisfy a master. As the carriage wheels began to churn the gravel, the sound reached Adrian in the ballroom. He scrambled to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass, his fingers leaving frantic, smudged prints on the pane. He watched the carriage pull away, carrying the only person who truly knew him, and the only person who had judged him worthy of ruin. He realized then that the one sentence wasn't just a revelation of his crimes, it was a verbal key that had unlocked his cage and locked his own. Evangeline had walked out into a world of sound, leaving him behind in a silence of his own making. He would sit in those empty halls for as long as the crown allowed, haunted by the ghost of a whisper. He had spent years demanding she speak, and now he would spend the rest of his life in a house where her voice was the only thing left to keep him company, repeating his failure over and over in the dark. The moral of the Duke's downfall was a bitter pill. Silence is not a void, but a weapon for those who know how to listen. Adrian's pride had been his blindfold, and Evangeline had simply waited for him to walk himself off the cliff. As the carriage disappeared from sight, the Duchess was gone, but her silence remained, heavy, absolute, and final. The morning sun rose to reveal the ultimate reversal of fortunes. Adrian stood in his empty study, realizing too late that his legal empire had been signed away under his own nose. He had been so obsessed with watching Evangeline's face for a crack that he remained blind to what her hands were doing in the shadows. The one sentence at the masquerade wasn't just a revelation, it was the final verbal key that unlocked his ruin and confirmed his absolute bankruptcy. This tale serves as a chilling reminder of the power of observation over intimidation. It proves that silence is never a void, but a reservoir of strength, and that the person who speaks the least often hears the most. Adrian's pride was a self-imposed blindfold, a fatal flaw that allowed Evangeline to simply wait for him to walk himself off the cliff of his own making. If you felt the chill of the Duke's downfall, make sure to hit the like button and let us know in the comments. What did you imagine her 7-word sentence was? Subscribe and turn on notifications to join us for more tales of high society revenge and dark secrets. Share this story with someone who thinks silence is a sign of surrender. They might just change their mind.